people are doing. So, we have the Xiaomi 14 in the house. Well, look, I'll be honest. The Xiaomi 14 Ultra is the one I want to compare. It's Xiaomi's greatest flagship, and it is coming in a month later, hopefully without any supply issues. And well, when it shows up, oh man, it's just gonna be a hell of a time. I can't wait, naturally. But with the Xiaomi 14, you see what entices me is that incredible price tag. I say incredible, that's actually allegedly incredible given that it actually delivers all the promise, which is to say, it has a lot of promise, or rather makes a lot of promises with the cameras and whatnot, but can it deliver? Well, we'll find out. So, if you've seen any of my X100's camera comparisons, you know exactly what I'm gonna do here. So right here we have the color profiles. And yes, both have their vibrant or vivid color profiles, and they look great in that regard. If anything, I would say the X100 is much more vivid, which I think given that it has multiple color profiles, the fact that the vivid is more vivid as opposed to the Xiaomi 14, you know, some might like that. But what I care about more than anything else is, of course, Leica, authentic and Zeiss natural colors on the X100 Pro. At this point, it's clear, to me at least, that the X100 Pro Zeiss natural colors, it's absolutely one of the best right here. And you can very easily see why I say that. The Xiaomi 14 is going way too overboard with the contrast with Leica authentic. It wasn't doing that with vibrant. It does that sometimes, other times it's really good, so there's inconsistency on the Xiaomi 14. That's really not a problem on the X100 Pro, well, at least not most of the time. But of course, if you do want to go crazy with the contrast, you do get a dedicated option on the X100 Pro, the textured mode. And yes, it looks ridiculous and crazy in this particular case because it's kinda backlit, but there is always a time and place for texture mode because as you can see, in this case where the lighting was much more flat, the X100 Pro looks really nice, rich, vibrant, high contrast, and that's kind of the whole point of textured mode. Now needless to say, you don't want to use textured mode all the time, so I stick to Zeiss natural colors because that's kind of the color profile I'm into. And well, in this case, it's kind of a backlit shot, and you can very easily tell that there's only one phone here which can handle the contrast balance impeccably. I mean, without question, the X100 Pro looks so much better and so much less flat as opposed to Xiaomi. Now I get it, the Xiaomi is really trying to give you as much detail as possible from the shadows and whatnot, but it just doesn't look that appealing, not to my eyes, because I do like high contrast and I think it's absolutely perfectly balanced on the X100 Pro in this case. Now this one I think is the most challenging shot in the entire comparison because essentially I took this right as the sun was about to set. Like there's very little light in the foreground to begin with, and it's also backlit on top of all that. So you can tell that it's problematic. Hell, I can even see some artifacting in the shadows on the Xiaomi 14. It really was getting that dark. The X100 Pro, it just generally goes for less exposure, which I guess that's fine. Given the time of day, it is, well, technically speaking, accurate. But let's face it, something right in between the two would be absolutely perfect, which is exactly what I did. I took Xiaomi's image, played with the contrast a little, and warmed it up just a pinch, and this is what I would consider to be the perfect image given the conditions, given the lighting, and all that jazz. But that is just hypothetical stuff here. With main camera close-ups, see, the interesting thing is this, both can get fairly close, and yeah, the Xiaomi is a little bit closer, but it's also focusing on farther parts of the image, the farther parts of the flowers. So it's very close of minimum focus distance with the main cameras at least. But what interests me here is the contrast we're getting on the X100 Pro. I'm telling you, the balance and the contrast with the X100, it really is unparalleled because the Xiaomi, it's good, it's a really nice shot, but you can see that the saturation in the flower is just a pinch higher, but it still doesn't look as punchy as the X100 Pro because the contrast is being handled so bloody well. Now at this point, I'm pretty sure you're looking at this and thinking, well, look at this Vivo fanboy, probably even commented already, but regardless, let me tell you this much. I was praising Vivo because the X100 was producing genuinely good and high contrast and beautifully balanced results as opposed to the Xiaomi. Now, it's just turned upside down entirely. The Xiaomi is now producing the better, more well-balanced, better contrast, better white balanced image with more accurate warmth in the scene, and it just looks perfect with the ultrawide camera. The X100, I don't know what happened, the main camera was doing so well, but then it just kind of blunders up this particular image. The weird warm tones, especially in the previous shot, that's what bothers me a lot, but thankfully in this case, even though we have kind of similar warmth, it's actually being handled really well on the X100 Pro. It's very similar to the Xiaomi 14 in this case, which is doing an exceptional job, and I think you can tell. The contrast balance is miles ahead. on the Xiaomi in this case. Like the X100, it doesn't even stand a chance. And now this, you see, this was even more backlit than the previous one because it's my comparison. I have to go crazy with the images. But well, I can tell you this much: the X100 just doesn't keep up with the ultrawide camera specifically. With the main camera, it was by all means definitely getting my preference, but with the ultrawide, it's night and day the difference. Like the Xiaomi 14 is so much better with the contrast. Just look at how beautifully it is preserving both the detail in the shadows and also making sure that it doesn't look flat. So that was one hell of a back and forth with the main and the ultrawide camera, but what I can tell you right now is that with the macro, Xiaomi did something kind of interesting, to say the very least, because they don't have ultra-wide macro. At least I couldn't find anything in the traditional macro settings or anything like that. Maybe there's something hidden way in the background or something like that, but regardless, they give us, instead, telephoto macro, which yes, the X100 has. I'll get to it. This is the ultra-wide macro on the X100 Pro, which looks good. And the Xiaomi 14's macro with the 3.2x telephoto is also looking really nice. There's no distortion either because you're using the telephoto. But simply because the X100 Pro has the versatility, I think it just takes macro by default. It can also use the telephoto or the periscope camera, the 4.3x periscope, for macro shots. And you might be thinking, well, it doesn't get as close, it can't focus as close, and it's not that good. Well, you'd be wrong, because we can use sensor crop on top of this, and it's some of the highest quality sensor crop that you're gonna get. So we get an 8.6x zoom effectively, and that gets closer than almost anything else that I've ever used. There are very few cameras out there that can even compete with the X100 Pro in terms of its macro capabilities. The Xiaomi 14 doesn't really get there yet. Maybe the 14 Ultra will. Now, of course, we were talking about zoom, so let's check it out. So this is the ultra-wide camera, and well, the only thing that I kind of like about the X100 Pro is that it is handling the sky a little bit better. It looks a little oddly blown out, I guess, on the 14. Not a huge deal, to be entirely honest. And with the main camera, actually now I prefer how the Xiaomi 14 looks. I think the X100 is oversaturating some of the greens, especially in the plants in the foreground. They just don't look very realistic. Even opposed to the X100's very own ultra-wide shot, it doesn't look very realistic. Now 2x, this is where things are just gonna be super interesting. Let me tell you right now, it's gonna be bloody juicy, because both come with hopefully nice 2x, that's what you're expecting, right? Well, the X100 Pro, we know for a fact at this point that it has some of the, if not the best, 2x sensor crop that we can get. The Xiaomi 14, on the other hand, most definitively does not. And it's unfortunate, I know, but it's just, you might be thinking, well, it didn't focus. It did, believe me, this is the best quality result that I could get. I took like 10, maybe even 15 shots, I don't even remember at this point. What I can tell you is this, at this point in time, the 2x sensor crop is basically unusable. And that is very unfortunate, but at the very least, it does have a 3.2x telephoto, which does work really well. Or so I thought. Because once again, we crop in 500% just as we did with the 2x sensor crop. And yeah, the X100 Pro, look, it doesn't have exceptionally higher levels of detail. It is sharpening a lot as opposed to the Xiaomi 14, which I get it. A lot of people don't like the sharpening, but let's face it, the X100 doesn't have any telephoto zoom except for the 4.3x that comes in later. This is from the main camera. That's how much detail this one bloody phone can preserve, even at 3.2x. That's definitely impressive, right? And look, I think it goes both ways, because the Xiaomi 14's 3x detail preservation isn't all that good, and the X100 Pro's main camera detail preservation is exceptionally good. So that's why you're seeing a result where both are very close, essentially. And then of course we have 4.3x, which yes, the X100 is gonna pull ahead. Yeah, it's naturally gonna happen. More optical zoom, and at this point, again, detail preservation is not something the X100 messes around with. Especially when we get to 10x, you can very easily tell that the X100 can produce near optical zoom levels of quality over here, with just how beautiful and sharp it is. It does not look over sharpened, not even on a big screen. While the Xiaomi 14, well, it's mushy. It looks like mashed potatoes. Well, maybe that was a little too harsh. Was it? I'm not sure. But what I can tell you right now is that both of these phones have 3 rear cameras, and all 3 of them give us 50 megapixel high res. Now, is it good enough? Well, that's exactly what we're gonna find out. So with the main camera, I would say it's very close. The X100 has more detail and it has more sharpening. So that's the only real difference between the two. And whether or not you prefer it is really going to depend on preference, but I also really need to mention this is a 500% crop, and yes, I get it. The whole point of high res is to get as much detail as you can possibly get, but still, it's a 500% crop. Most people are never gonna crop in this much, even with high res. Now with the Ultrawide, it's a similar story. We get 51 pixels. So 500% crop really reveals that it's the exact same thing as the main camera. Both are fairly good, and I also think that the X100 Pro once again has more sharpening. So as long as you're fine with slightly higher sharpening happening in the shots, you're actually gonna get a really good result from the X100 regardless of what you're using. Now with the 3.2x, see, 3.2x, the regular shot wasn't really much. So is the 51 pixel really gonna help the Xiaomi 14? Well, to answer that question, I think it will. It definitely seems a little bit better. It does have some sharpening artifacts and some haloing going on the Xiaomi 14, that is, but it's obviously much better, much more detailed as opposed to the X100 Pro. I would at least expect as much, especially when you have both optical zoom and high res. Hell, I would expect even more from the Xiaomi 14, but I'll take what I can get. Now look, with 4.3x, I don't think I need to tell you that the X100 is going to perform better, but I do want to point out that the image itself, the colors look a little bit better, the exposure, the contrast looks more realistic on the Xiaomi 14. I think a lot of the warmth is just being lost on the X100 Pro because it is lifting up the highlights so much. And of course, when we crop in, the X100 is gonna pull ahead. That's just gonna happen because not only does it have the high res and the optical zoom, it also has the incredible processing behind it, which really helps bring out details. Now, moving on to selfies. You see, as far as I can remember, the Xiaomi 13 Ultra kind of sucked with selfies. I'm so glad to see that Xiaomi 14 improved on it because it's definitely one of the areas where they were really lacking. And even when I took the selfie, immediately I felt like, well, this looks way better than I thought it would. Now, more or less, it's very close, but I do think that the Xiaomi 14 is actually pulling ahead. If you look at the background, the building, it looks a little less flat as opposed to the X100 Pro. It is a minor difference, of course, but still worth pointing out. Now, in this case, this is an anomaly on both phones. I say that because you can see that it's not really all that difficult. That's just light falling on the side of my face. It shouldn't be a massive challenge for either, right? But they're both messing it up and blowing it out entirely, and overall it looks very flat. I'm not really sure why that happened. I'll get to the reasoning behind it, but first we have this backlit selfie. This is part of the reasoning. Like, if they can handle the backlit selfie so well, hell, I would say the Xiaomi 14 is handling the glare a little bit better. Now, this could be because the angle of the selfie was a little bit different as opposed to the X100 Pro because, you know, I'm taking selfies. It's always going to vary a little. But yeah, for the most part, both are doing exceptionally well and so much better than the previous shots, right? And then selfie portraits. Now, see, this is an interesting one. So, both phones, I think they're doing really well. I really like the bokeh on the Xiaomi 14. It's just bringing it out enough. It's a very natural form of bokeh that we get. But what I think makes the Xiaomi 14 pull ahead is the warmth on my face. Yes, it's not perfectly natural skin tones, I get that, but also it's sunlight that's lighting my face. Warm sunset time sunlight. So the colors that you're seeing are very natural and more natural as opposed to the X100 Pro. Now this is why I said the previous selfie was an anomaly. Because you see, in this particular case, even the X100, which is blowing out some of the highlights on the side of my face, it's doing a significantly better job. The Xiaomi 14 is doing a perfect job. This is exactly what I had expected, both in this case and in the previous selfie, but it's handling the contrast really well. It's just handling the highlights perfectly, and the bokeh in the background, they look delicious. And now, the backlit selfie portrait had to happen, right? So, I think in this particular case, the contrast is just a little bit better on the X100 Pro. But otherwise, it's very close on both the highlight preservation, all that stuff. It's very good and very close. I do think that the bokeh is much more pronounced on the Xiaomi 14, which I do prefer. And I actually didn't even mention, both phones in this case have some edge detection issues going on, more so on the X100 Pro if you look right above my sunglass. And also the X100 Pro had some edge detection issues in the previous shot as well. Now, as good as the previous selfies were, what I can tell you is this much. The night selfies are just not worth it. It looks kind of terrible on both, and I'm really surprised that two smartphones that focus so much on cameras don't have good night selfies. It bothers me a lot at this point. Now then, let's move on to regular portraits. Now at 1x zoom, I would say that both are doing a fairly good job, but the X100 Pro looks significantly better simply because it has so much better contrast. Like the Xiaomi, it just looks flat, and it is also blowing out a lot of the highlights. Now at 35mm, it's a very similar story. I think that's like a 1.5x crop if I'm not wrong. I do think that the contrast is significantly better, which just makes the image look so much better on the X100 Pro, but I do want to point out, the X100 also seems to have some blue that is injecting into the shadows that you can tell on the Xiaomi 14 that my shirt, it looks grey, but it is supposed to be black. but on the X100, it looks kind of bluish. Now that 50mm, something interesting happened. So I think both are looking fairly nice. The Xiaomi has a lot of contrast. I mean, it's on the verge of blowing out some of the highlights on my face. But then I also got another result, and in this case I think it was the Xiaomi 14 just telling me, yeah, I got a boatload of dynamic range for you, boy. Because that's essentially what's going on. The dynamic range is really good, which is to say, on the Xiaomi 14. And I do like the color of the shirt on the Xiaomi 14. Once again, the X100 just seems to have a lot of blue and magenta being injected into the blacks, which just makes no sense to me. Now then, with 75mm, now finally the X100 is doing a much better job with my t-shirt. It looks much more black as opposed to the blue that we were getting previously. But the fact is this, it is very warm. I do want to point out that is natural because I took this fairly late, like really late sunset, and it looks so much more natural on the X100 as opposed to the Xiaomi 14, which like I can't even see any of the warmth. The fact that I took it at sunset, it's not even believable on the Xiaomi 14. It's gone that far with the overcompensation. Now the 90mm on the Xiaomi 14 is I think one of the worst, most wasted opportunities that I've ever seen, because you have this weird looking dreamlike filter that is baked in, and I complained about this with the Xiaomi 13 Ultra as well. It's very unfortunate that they didn't fix this on the 14, which it's just like, let us turn off the filter, that's all we're asking. You don't need to do anything else. Of course, you didn't think I'd forget the backlit. In my comparison, no backlit? Oh my lord, the heresy. Well, anyways, look, I think it's pretty clear. The X100 is doing a slightly better job. Just look at the sky and look at how well the highlights are being preserved on the X100. It's just a little bit better, but I think it makes a pretty significant difference in the look of the image overall. Now 50mm is actually not bad on the Xiaomi. There's a lot of glare going on both, much more on the Xiaomi 14 I think. Maybe it's because of the processing, or maybe a little bit of the angle has to do with it, I'm not entirely certain, but it is there. Now I do think that the Xiaomi 14 has a lot of brightening going on my face particularly, but it's not horrible. It's not all that good, but it's not horrible either. It's one of the better face brightenings that I've seen in all the time that I've made camera comparisons. The X100 doesn't do any of that. It's just like, yeah, these are the natural colors, just go with it. I actually prefer that approach. Now when it comes to night portraits, I think the Xiaomi is good, it's not bad, but the X100 overall, it definitely pulls ahead, because not only is it maintaining perfect white balance, the only light in this entire scene was a dim, warm light, and you can very easily tell that's the case. On the X100, it is maintaining that white balance perfectly without going overboard with it. The Xiaomi 14 again overcompensates a lot, which I'm not really a big fan of. Also, details are significantly higher on the X100. Now the night mode, so initially, I believe that the Xiaomi will pull ahead, and that's exactly what's happening. For a very simple reason, it just gives you so much more realistic looking night shots. On the X100, yeah, that night sky, it just doesn't work for me. I know it works for a lot of people actually even like bluish night skies. Well, good for you, but if we get an enhanced night sky option, I want something that does the exact opposite of that. Here's another main camera shot. It's a similar story. Like, the Xiaomi 14 looks very realistic, and as you know, at this point, I really like realistic looking colors with good high contrast. The X100 Pro does contrast really well at night mode, and so does the Xiaomi 14, but the colors, especially the night sky colors, just doesn't work for me. In my case, I guess it is a little unfortunate, but preferences are always gonna be there, right? But in this case, well, this was difficult, I'll tell you that much, because the amount of light you're seeing is not the amount even I could see. And if you're wondering, that teal that's happening, that's coming from my laptop's keyboard backlight. That's how dim it was. That's one of the major light sources in the scene. But well, what I can tell you is this. It looks really nice upon first glance, but when we crop in, you can very distinctively tell that the Xiaomi 14 just has a little bit more noise, a little bit more grain, a little bit more artifacting, and a little bit less detail as opposed to the X100 Pro. I'm saying little for all of them, but at the end of the day, all of those things stack up and just make the X100 look a fair bit better as opposed to the Xiaomi 14 here. Now then, ultra low light. Well, X100 Pro, if you have seen any of my previous comparisons, I'm pretty sure you can tell, it's basically undefeated in ultra low light. The Xiaomi 14, it's not built for ultra low light, that much I can tell you right now. It just doesn't have the exposure time and maybe even the processing to really handle situations like these. The X100 obviously does. Then we have the ultrawide camera, and you see, in this particular case, I kind of like how the night sky looks on the X100 Pro, I kind of wish we got similar kinds of night skies with the main camera. And I do still prefer Xiaomi's night sky as opposed to the X100 in this case, but I'm telling you, if we got night skies like this with the main camera on the X100, I'd be a very happy man indeed. But that's just not happening. However, let's head into it because this is a very challenging shot. Not only do we have very warm light, which you can probably tell from the X100 shot, the Xiaomi, again, overcompensation, once again we see it here, and it really takes you out of the look of the image that I was going for. I really wanted that warmth to be represented, which the X100 is doing really well. It's staying true to it, but not going crazy with it. That's really the balance that I'm looking for. But the other thing I always look for is details, of course, and at 500% crop, I think I can tell there's only one phone that has good detail here. Moving on, this is by far the most difficult shot that I had because it's not only ultra low light with the ultrawide camera, it is also kind of backlit. And yeah, you can tell the X100 Pro is leaps and bounds ahead. There's no two ways about that. The Xiaomi 14 really can't handle these situations now, can it? It can do night skies really well, but it just cannot handle really dark situations like these. But anyways, let's check out zoom at night. Now, ideally, you shouldn't really use zoom all that much because you're gonna get worse quality as opposed to the main camera, but well, we do have some versatility here. The 2x zoom in particular looks really nice on both. You might remember that 2x sensor crop on the Xiaomi doesn't really look all that good in daylight, but turns out in low light and the problems that you face with sensor crop at nighttime, yeah, they kind of make it very similar on both. So my issue is this: if it can produce an image like this at night, why can it not produce an image on par with the X100 Pro during daytime when there's ample amounts of light, right? This just makes me believe that it's not a hardware problem, but rather something that might be fixed by software. Whether they will do it or not, that's a different story. But of course, then we have 3x. Now, without question, at night at least, the 3x is gonna be better on the Xiaomi 14. And even though it looks a little too dark on the Xiaomi as opposed to the X100, which is handling the colors and the white balance a little bit better, when we crop in, I think it's more than obvious that the Xiaomi is pulling ahead because yeah, it has optical zoom. The X100 does not. In a similar fashion, we have the 4.3x crop. Now, again, I don't have to zoom in this case. The X100 is beautifully detailed, but it is also horribly unbalanced with the content. I don't really know what's going on here. There's just a ridiculous amount of exposure going on, maybe, like there's no contrast and it just looks weird. There's this blue tinge in a lot of the highlights and whatnot, but yeah, suffice to say that was kind of a failure in terms of colors and contrast on the X100, which is why I took another. This is also a 4.3x, and again, I took it in warm light because I wanted to see if the same kinds of problems persisted. They do not, oddly enough. If anything, the Xiaomi in this case is actually pumping a lot more magenta into the shot, which is not all that natural. The X100 is basically as perfect as I could have gotten it to be. But what I do know is this. This was close. Let's face it, it is way closer than I actually honestly thought it would be. The Xiaomi 14 seems to be keeping up with the promises. Look, to be entirely honest, the X100 Pro does pull out when it comes to everything, all that it can provide, and all the other camera features on top of the regular stuff that we have here. Check out the camera review I made for the X100 Pro. There's a lot more that the X100 Pro can do. But fact is this, the X100 Pro might be a little bit better, but for the price tag, what Xiaomi 14 can provide, it's really good. Which is why I'm going to compare it against the OnePlus 12 next, because I think that's going to be perfect. I mean, think about it. It's basically similar in terms of pricing. So I might even go so far as to say that the Xiaomi 14 might turn out to be better. Maybe. We'll see. I'm not entirely certain. I haven't taken any shots yet. But yeah, this is looking good for the Xiaomi 14. I'm really glad that Xiaomi fixed the selfies, first and foremost, and I do hope that they fix the 2x sensor crop. That's the only real major issue that we have. Well, with that said, I do hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and I'll be seeing you guys soon with more. Cheers.